Okay, here we are for Chapter 3, Unit Guide, Spirit Reform 1828 to 1845. Now, I do want to make it clear that some of these things in this section have been dropped from the exam. They're on the study guide because we weren't sure if we're going to keep them in or not, but I did try and note the ones that are not on the exam because I don't want you to worry about them if you're not going to be tested on them next week. So let's talk about Jacksonian America in the terms here in Jacksonian America. Few things to be aware of. One is suffrage. This is the right to vote in political elections. And during this time period with Andrew Jackson in power, in certainly the years leading up to it, you see an expansion of voting rights or expansion of suffrage. Before it was wealthy property owners, wealthy white male property owners. Now it's just white guys. You don't have to own property. So you're expanding the voter pool. So you're expanding suffrage, which is the right to vote. Later on, we'll talk about women's suffrage, which would be the right for women to vote. So suffrage is the right to vote. Other events that happened during Andrew Jackson's tenure that are worth talking about. One is the Trail of Tears. This is the forced removal of Cherokee Native Americans to reservations in the West. Thousands died during this journey. The Trail of Tears basically forces the Cherokee off of the lands in Georgia primarily, but in other southeastern states too, and forces them further and further west. The argument was, oh, it's going to be for their own safety, it's going to be for their own good, it's going to be for their own benefit, so forth and so on. It wasn't. It was a land grab. More and more settlers were expanding in the southeast. They wanted more territory to grow cotton, more territory to grow crops, and they wanted Native Americans off the land, off the territory. So it forced them to move. Evidence of this is in Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, which is the last term on the list, which is a court case that basically gave a free hand to force Native Americans off the territory, off the land. So that's Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And it basically phrased it so that the Native Americans aren't considered a separate entity, separate country, if you will, so that the United States wouldn't have to deal with them like we would if it was Canada, Mexico, England, France, China, Japan. It's like, no, they are a separate entity. We're not giving them the rights of it being a foreign power, which, because if we did, we would have had to interact with them differently. The spoil system is something else Andrew Jackson institutes. He's going to give jobs to political supporters. So this is going to be his system. The idea is that to the victor go the spoils. So when he becomes president, he dismisses a whole bunch of people that were put in place by John Quincy Adams, and he replaces them with his supporters. So guys that gave him money, guys that supported him, guys that campaigned on his behalf, his friends, his buddies. We still see this today. You figure there are any number of government officials who got the position because they donated money to campaign funds, things along those lines. Don't worry, 9 times out of 10, they're put in positions that don't matter a whole lot. No offense, but like if you're the ambassador to New Zealand, it's not really like mission critical. You know what I mean? It's not super, super important, but you get a nice government paycheck. You get a sweet, cushy job. You get certain privileges because you get to live in New Zealand and you're an ambassador. So that's what we're talking about. It's jobs given to political supporters, not necessarily people that deserve it, but people who you want to give it to because they got you back. Nullification comes to a head under Jackson's tenure. A nullification is the state's right to reject federal laws. This is going to create conflict between states and the federal government because certain laws, like South Carolina, are going to say, no, 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 we're not going to, we don't like this law, so we're going to nullify it. We are refusing to follow this federal law, and is an example of prioritizing states' rights over federal rights. And the idea is that if you prioritize your state's rights over the national rights or federal rights, then you don't really have a country. So this is going to come to a head again in South Carolina over the nullification crisis, and it eventually will end up leading to the Civil War. It's not a coincidence that South Carolina leads the way on nullification, and then it leads the way again when it comes to secession and the Civil War. Speaking of secession, that is the term secede. It means to withdraw from the Union. Southern states would do it during the Civil War. To secede means to break away. And then Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, I mentioned under the Trail of Tears, so I think that's pretty straightforward. Let's move on to our second column. Our second column is a changing culture. So we're seeing things change, not always in a positive way. Nativism at this time becomes more rampant. This is favoring established inhabitants over immigrants. So as the Irish and the Germans start immigrating to America, remember we talked about the potato famine? As they start coming to America, you have more and more people that are wanting to reject these foreigners. They don't like them. They want them to go away. They don't like the fact that they're different culture, different language, different religion. And it really creates this us versus them mentality. And so this is where you start to really have that first anti-immigration kind of rhetoric, because prior to this time, most of the immigrants that came to the United States were English or French, and most of those folks were their time goes back a long way in the New World. You know, the French helped us during the Revolution, and heck, the French explored much of North America. The English, meanwhile, you know, everyone who came to America early on, a lot of them were from England, so there were some similarities there. But Germany and Ireland are different, and so they're going to create this sense of anti-immigration, this sense of nativism, where you want to favor the established inhabitants over immigrants. Utopia, it's not on the exam. It just means a perfect world, perfect society. It's the idea that they can create one. Romanticism is dropped from the exam. That's when you idealize things. Think of romanticism as like your first crush in elementary school or maybe middle school. You look up at this person, you think they're perfect, they're amazing, there's nothing wrong with them. When in reality, of course, there is. There's warts, there's pimples, you know, they got, you know, cross eyed, whatever. The idea is that romanticism is you gloss over those imperfections and you make things look um, more ideal, more romanticized. So not romantic in terms of like getting down on one knee with flowers and proposing, but romantic in the sense of you're idealizing and glossing over all the imperfections. But again, not on the exam. Transcendentalism, philosophy focusing on individual spiritual experience, is going to be pioneered by Henry David Thoreau. There is one question on the exam about transcendentalism, and the guy's name is Henry David Thoreau. If you know that, you'll be okay. But the idea here is that let's go out there and get close to nature. So instead of having a pastor or a preacher tell you about God, go out in nature, feel it. You know, be with the woods, be in the silence, listen to things, you know, really, really experience these things firsthand and make your own individual spiritual connection to the world at large. And that really is what religion is all about. And then finally, Mormons, they're dropped from the exam. But remember, these are the religious minority. They move out to Utah so they can practice freely. They were basically chased out of New York and then chased out of Missouri for practicing polygamy, among other things. But they, again, didn't make the cut. So we're gonna move on. Reforming society, same thing. A bunch of things were dropped. Dorothea Dix, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, both of them were avid women's rights advocates. They didn't make the exam. The temperance movement gets caught up in the women's rights movement, or really more vice versa. Temperance is a movement to ban alcohol or at least limit it. So to temperance is to like reduce alcohol consumption, if not get rid of it outright. The reason women were such a powerful force in the temperance movement is if you're a guy and you go out to the bar and you drink, you're spending the family money. And then if you come home drunk, there's lots of cases of domestic abuse and domestic violence. So women really got screwed on that one. The women's argument was listen, the alcohol is causing men to be bad husbands. The alcohol is causing men to spend family money, making the family and the kids destitute. So the women are going to speak up because they are feeling the ill effects of this. And so that's really what it comes down to. Penitentiary, just new jails, but again, we're getting rid of those. Horace Mann is the father of public education. He's actually a Massachusetts guy. He's going to push to make schools free for all children. The idea is that you should have a universal basic education for people. Like everyone should know how to read, everyone should know how to do basic math. And this is good for democracy. We'll get to that in a minute. But it's also needed because workers are needed, right? You figure at this time, if you're going to go work, not on the farm, but in a store, in a factory, you need to have some basic understanding of the way things work. Like you need to have literacy. You need to be able to work through blueprints. You need to be able to problem solve. And so Horace Mann was a big proponent of that because he saw what the jobs that the kids are going to have, and so you got to prepare them for it. If you're doing nothing but milking cows and planting crops on a farm, you don't need a high school education necessarily. You're going to learn everything you need by being out in the field and by studying and kind of doing. Whereas if you're going to work in a factory and you got to fix this machine that's busted, or you have to resolve this, you know, complex delivery system or whatever. Like these are things that you need to be able to do. And so Horace Mann with public education is going to help you achieve those things or teach you how. And last but not least, Seneca Falls Convention. It's the first women's rights convention. It focused on women's voting rights and, again, social equality. The temperance movement, the abolition movement, the women's rights movement all get kind of wrapped in as one, because these are all groups, women and African Americans in particular, who are constantly being given the second seating, right? It's white men come first, and then kind of everybody else follows after that. And so, because African American men were enslaved, women were treated as second class citizens, and African American women had it worst of all. There's going to be the sense of, okay, we need to improve this. We need to set a level playing field for everybody. So Seneca Falls was going to be the push for women's rights. The abolitionist movement, as I mentioned before, it's really going to come about in a couple different ways. It's out of this religious awakening, this religious experience that people rediscover religion and God and morality and what's right. And so there's two ways of looking at abolition, which is the destruction of slavery. One is gradualism. It's in the definition is in the term. It's a gradual, emancipation of enslaved people. So over time, you'll slowly start to free more and more people, or give these people rights, so that over the span of 40 years, you are eventually getting rid of slavery. That's the idea. That's the thought process behind it. It gives the economy time to adjust. It gives society time to adjust, so forth and so on. But as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, justice long delayed is justice denied. So that the gradualism argument was accepted by many because they thought the gradualism would continue for, 100 years. And that's not really eliminating slavery. Abolition, meanwhile, is the immediate ending of slavery. Like, let's get rid of it today. Like, pass a law. It's done. And emancipation is the actual process of freeing enslaved people. So when we say the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Lincoln, it was the freeing of enslaved people. William Lloyd Garrison, and the next term, the Liberator, these go hand in hand because William Lloyd Garrison was an abolitionist. He published the Liberator newspaper. This advocated an end to slavery. It published information, sometimes in code, about how to access the Underground Railroad, where to go, where safe houses were, maps, materials, things along those lines, advice. So the idea was that it was a great resource for people that were looking to end slavery. So it would publish stories about people that were enslaved and the horrors of slavery. It would talk about how to get around the future slave law if bounty hunters were in the neighborhood, in the area, stuff like that. Things that would help people who are against slavery do their job more effectively by helping enslaved people escape to freedom, or to advocate and convince more people that slavery needed to go. Frederick Douglass is probably the best guy for this. Don't forget, Frederick Douglass, we talked about in class, he was a former slave. He was enslaved in Maryland, and his experiences there and his ability to read and write and speak so eloquently really convinced a lot of people. I mean, this is a guy, he becomes one of the most famous Americans at the time because he goes on these speaking tours and he talks to people about, hey, this is what I saw. He speaks so eloquently and so forcefully that people are like, there's no way this guy was a former slave. He had to have been educated at some fancy school and so forth and so on, which actually causes him to write the narrative, the narrative of a slave, which is his autobiography, being like, I'm going to lay everything out there so that people can understand its reality. Like, they can trace it back and see that it is true. And so that's Frederick Douglass. Again, he's going to be an advocate for abolition for obvious reasons. He was a runaway former slave. And then finally, Nat Turner. He's a guy who's going to lead a violent slave rebellion in 1831. Dozens of people were killed. Ultimately, Nat Turner and many of his followers are killed. But this is another example of pushing for an end to slavery. Nat Turner tried to do it violently from within the system of slavery there's down south. Garrison and Douglass were doing it from the outside, more on the north, trying to convince people to work against slavery. So section 1, how did the expansion of voting rights contribute to Andrew Jackson's victory in 1828? Pretty simple. Before 1828, it was primarily property owners that could vote. So rich white guys were the ones that could vote, and pretty much just them. As we get to the 1828 election, these property requirements are removed, and Jackson is seen as like the common man's president, right? He's their guy. He's the average Joe. And so more people support Jackson. More of these uneducated, poor, middle class white people, white men, support Jackson. And that's going to allow them to vote in droves for Jackson and have him become president. Had it the property rights requirements maintained, in other words, if only white men with property could vote, you potentially still have John Quincy Adams in office because he was the learned man's guy, right? John Quincy Adams was smart, he was eloquent, he kind of came from that American aristocracy with John Adams as president. Whereas Jackson is the common man. And because the common man are able to vote, and there's a hell of a lot more common man than there is the rich, wealthy men, Jackson's going to win. Next one. Why would South Carolina threaten to secede from the Union due to new federal tariffs? That's pretty simple. It's going to ruin their economy. The tariff of 1828, this tariff of abominations, it's going to make it more expensive for them to purchase goods, and it's going to make it more difficult for them to export cotton. The idea is if we put a tariff on British goods, Britain's going to put a tariff on our goods. And so South Carolina gets hit by the double whammy. South Carolina, who likes to buy stuff from Britain, now will have to pay a tax on the stuff they buy from Britain. Okay, they get hit once. They have to pay more for the stuff they buy from Britain because it's a tariff on imported goods. Britain, meanwhile, is going to respond with a tariff on their goods with a tariff on American goods, meaning that when South Carolina goes to sell their cotton is now more expensive to Britain. So what this means is that South Carolina has to pay more for stuff they need, and the people that buy the stuff South Carolina makes, cotton, will have to pay more for it, and thus they don't buy as much. So you get hit on both sides. Your income is going down and your costs are going up. So that's why South Carolina hated it. They were absolutely against it. Describe how the United States became more democratic during Andrew Jackson's presidency. Again, the increased participation in government. We talked about the common man getting more of a vote. People being put into more elected positions and having more political power. It really is a more democratic process. It's more open. You're getting more of your average Joes in government, which by definition is more democratic. So let's take a look at section 2. Why did the arrival of Irish and German immigrants lead to a growth of nativism within the United States? The big difference here is, again, the differences. They are different. German and Irish immigrants are different than the people who live here. The Irish are Catholic. Most Americans are Protestant. The Germans speak German. Most Americans speak English. So there's this concern about like the Germans and the Irish are going to take the jobs of the Americans that are here. There's certainly some racial elements too that the Irish aren't considered to be as evolved and as refined as some of the English or the Americans. So there's really going to be this backlash against immigrants. It's going to culminate in the formation of groups like the Know Nothing Party, which if you ask people about it, they'd be like, oh, I don't know anything. I don't know nothing about it. And this was a very anti-immigrant party. They would beat up Irish immigrants. They'd walk through immigrant communities and kind of beat people up, scare people, intimidate them. And that's what you saw. And don't forget, we talked about this before too, right? We even see remnants of this today, where the Irish would settle, oftentimes in ports, and you see the growth of pubs, things on those lines. You look at the German and Scandinavian communities you have in the upper Midwest. Like a lot of the folks that came during this time tended to settle in certain areas, and they've stayed, many of them. What religious denominations emerged in the United States in the Second Great Awakening? The Methodists, the Baptists, they both grew and expanded. Don't worry about the specifics there. Just know that religion became a little bit bigger, certainly leading to abolition of slavery. Why do you think the penny press was significant? Developments in journalism. The penny press basically lowered the price of newspapers. So if newspapers are cheaper, more people can read them. If more people can read them, literacy rates go up. And that goes hand in hand with increased democracy. Because as more people read and know what's going on, more people can have a say, people vote smarter, more people decide to run for office. So it does grow that sense of democracy. Most of this will not be heavy on the exam. There's an Irish and German immigration question. There's a know nothing question, but don't worry about the denominations, the religious ones. That one didn't make the cut. What is the temperance movement? We mentioned it on the vocabulary term above. It's a campaign against alcohol consumption, in which women played a large role. Educational reformers believed education was important in a democratic republic. Smart people tend to vote for smart people. If you're intelligent, you have your wits about you, you see what's going on in the world, you tend to cast an educated vote. And that leads to better candidates, better quality candidates. If you are dumb, you will vote for dumb people, and dumb people will be leading the country. And that is negative. That has a negative effect on the country as a whole. So it really is seen as education is the key for a successful democracy. You need an educated citizenry to ensure that you elect good people, intelligent people, competent people for these jobs of leading the country. And if you don't do that, you're going to end up in rough shape. Your country's going to be in a bad spot. And then, as far as the Second Great Awakening and reform movements, because of these religious revivals, like people find God a little bit more, you're going to see a number of reform movements in women's rights, abolition of slavery, because people are going to start to kind of find their own way with religion, and they're going to redefine what religion means to them and expand its application of what is moral and what is right. And then finally, section 4. How are abolition and gradualism different? Simple. Gradualism was the slow phase out of slavery. Abolition was the immediate end of slavery. That's it. Abolition, slavery should end immediately, instantaneously. Make a law, pass the law, get it done. Gradualism is over years, maybe decades, eventually slavery will come to an end. Like, we will make sure that old people that can't work will not make them slaves, and then in 10 years time we'll make it people over the age of 50 and they won't be slaves, and it'll just kind of work it that way. Angela Grimke and Sojourner Truth are both women who spoke out against slavery, argued for women's rights. They broke gender norms at the time, so they're kind of prominent for that. They didn't make the exam, but they're certainly worthy of knowing and knowing what they did. How did free African Americans work to end slavery? A bunch of different ways. Free African Americans kept safe houses on the Underground Railroad. They provided supplies, provided information for people who were trying to escape slavery to the North. They published newspapers. They wrote letters of their accounts if they were runaway slaves. Think Frederick Douglass. So they're going to work to publicize the accounts of what slavery is to ensure its destruction in the North. And they're going to be assisting those who are fleeing slavery from the South. And then last but not least, it's kind of odd. People don't quite get it, but understand, we talked about how history is complex. There are plenty of people in the North who are not a big fan of abolition, and there are some people in the South that are, not okay with slavery. Why did many business people in the North oppose abolitionism? It's kind of simple when you think about it. Those mills that we saw in Lowell, Massachusetts, those mills that make textiles, they make fabric, they make clothes. What do you think they make fabric out of? What do you think they make clothes out of? It's made out of cotton. So if you eliminate slavery down south, the major product that is utilized by those folks that are enslaved that they harvest is cotton. So if you free the slaves, what happens to cotton production? It falls off a cliff, right? You're not going to have the slaves. Who's going to pick the cotton? Nobody. So cotton production stops. If you don't have cotton, what is the mill making? What does it use to make clothes if there's no cotton available to it? So some northern businesses opposed abolition because they looked at it as, you eliminate the slaves, that would eliminate the cotton. If you eliminate the cotton, that causes my mill to shut down. That affects my bottom line as a northern business man or northern factory owner. So that's really what that thing is there. All right. So this is the end of section number, I think it's 3, right? Section number 3, this change and reform. There are more videos, so if this is the first section you've done, awesome. Look at other ones, jump around. Just make sure that you get this information, you have an understanding of it. Hopefully the context provided makes a little bit of sense. Hopefully you got some of it down. Again, remember, just filling out the study guide is never enough. You have to actually study from it. Make a Quizlet, practice with somebody, pair up with somebody, make flashcards. Like, you got to work through it. Just sitting there and reading it, rereading it, reading it over doesn't always do the job. So I'm glad you made it this far. I'm glad hopefully you have it filled out. But think about how you're going to study, because now you have the what. You've got the what written down. I gave you the what. Now you got to figure out the how. How will you study? How will you prepare? We'll talk about that before the mid-year exam.